Hello, my name is Jonathan Sherpa. I'm an undergraduate senior here at the University of Oregon with a major in music composition. Today I'd like to present my piece titled Coping Mechanism. It's a string trio in 6 movements, 4 of which have been completed, and you'll hear it performed today by the Delgany String Quartet. The Delgany String Quartet is a professional ensemble based here in Oregon who I was lucky enough to participate in a residency with, where they performed my music as well as the music of my colleagues. My goal of this presentation is to explain some of my compositional processes and influences when composing this piece, what this piece means to me personally and how it helped me grow as a composer, and what I hope it can mean to others who may listen to it. So why did I write this piece? Well, I wanted to write something that would codify a lot of personal struggles that I was dealing with leading up to composing it, not the least of which was recovering from COVID-19. And I also wanted to create a piece that was deeply personal to me as a composer, that elaborated upon my interests and invigorated my love for music that was meaningful to me, and also create a piece that might be relatable to anyone who was struggling with loss or difficulty, whether it's loss of a family member or even difficulty with dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the principal ideas I had when composing this piece was the notion of an overarching narrative, where each movement could be diverse, but still have a sense of cohesion and relationship back to a principal idea or theme. In this case, I used the stages of grief as a vague model, but I focused more on the personal emotions I was experiencing through my process of composing this piece. Each movement is representative of their title through different musical means, and each has their own identity, but each has a relationship back to the principal idea, which is that of overcoming anxiety and grief. And I accomplished this by modifying a compositional technique that is used by a composer that influenced me greatly. That composer is Richard Wagner and the leitmotif. A leitmotif is a technique where a composer can create an association between a musical motive and a specific emotion, idea, or a theme. In this case, I used the 2 shown beneath Wagner's portrait. However, instead of using these ideas verbatim, I wanted to expand upon the idea of a leitmotif by using elements of these 2 motives and interspersing them throughout the entirety of the piece, thereby achieving a greater level of cohesion and connection between all of the movements. In particular, the rising chromatic figure from Motive 2, as well as the minor second augmented 4th leap of Motive 1. These are inherently dissonant qualities to each of these motives, and they're what contribute to the piece's overall air of anxiety. Another composer that had an enormous influence on both my compositional processes and this particular piece is Johann Sebastian Bach and his use of counterpoint. Counterpoint is essentially the combination of 2 or more independent musical ideas played simultaneously and often imitatively. This can be seen in pieces such as fugues, canons, and inventions, of which 3 of the movements of this piece are modeled after. And it was another means of me creating cohesion throughout the piece by pervasively using counterpoint. Starting with the first movement, I wanted to create a world that sounded both melancholic while also having an air of anxiety, where we draw the listener in as if always searching for an answer, but never quite finding out what it is. And the way that I achieved this was by using elements from the first motive, namely the rising chromatic line, which never truly resolves. It begins on this G natural in the violin and gradually begins rising chromatically higher and higher and higher until eventually it reaches this high E flat. However, once it does, it's unaccompanied by the other instruments and thus sounds pretty anticlimactic, as if saying, "This isn't what you were looking for." Trying once more, the violin starts on a D natural and gradually begins its ascent once again, higher and higher and higher until it reaches that same E flat, once again unaccompanied. However, it reaches just a step higher to this F natural and is accompanied by a full-bodied yet dissonant chord, as if saying, "You found something, but it's not quite what you were looking for." This sense of longing continues throughout the first movement, and as the piece gradually begins to get more and more turbulent, embedding itself in the idea of longing, near the end the first motive appears here. This is important for what's called word painting in music, where a composer can represent extra musical ideas through certain musical expressions. In this case, presenting the first motive near the end as the piece gradually gets more and more dissonant associates this motive with anxiety, turbulence, and dissonance. In addition, alongside it is the second motive, marked here, with its rising chromatic ascent. This creates an association between these two motives, and the association is that of turbulence, dissonance, and struggle. And I'd now like to play for you an excerpt from the end of the first movement. Following the increasing turbulence of the first movement, the second movement begins immediately and very dissonantly with a pervasive use of the first movement's rising chromatic line, but in a very frenetic form. This sudden change in texture is meant to be representative of an anxiety attack, which is something I personally struggle with. Notice that it begins in the cello, gradually migrates to the viola, and is later transferred to the violin, although unfortunately it is not pictured here. This imitation is borrowed from the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, again a composer very close to my heart, and was done with the intent of creating a very dense and overwhelming texture akin to the nature of an anxiety attack. My goal, by using the same rising chromatic line while varying the texture through my use of counterpoint, was to create a connection between the first two movements, while also having the second movement have a unique identity. Another way I attempted to illustrate the piece's narrative of overwhelming anxiety was through alterations in timbre. In this case, I used a technique called soulponticello, where a string player may play their instrument in a way that creates a very hollow, almost ethereal kind of sound. Notice that each player reiterates the opening motif of the rising chromatic line. However, each one plays soulponticello. Therefore, the sound created is very hollow, as if the players have lost their voices from the previously dissonant passages. This is meant to be representative of the overwhelming and destructive nature of anxiety. I'd like to play the second movement in its entirety for you. This leads us to the third movement, titled Anger. My goal with this movement was to illustrate how bottling up strong emotions can eventually lead to an emotional overload and an outburst of anger. In this case, the sudden destructive nature of the second movement sets up a dangerous precedent for the third movement to continue from. Therefore, as if not knowing how to proceed, the violin begins on an awkward, misguided, and ultimately misplaced pizzicato rhythm, the notes of which are derived from the motive 1, which led us into the second movement. Accompanying it is a very loud, obtrusive chord played by the cello, which is meant to harken back towards the obtrusiveness of the second movement. And like the second movement, this pizzicato idea is mimicked between both the viola and the violin. This pattern of pizzicatos continues throughout the third movement, with the cello becoming increasingly frustrated by the pizzicato's meek and unsubstantial nature. The rising tension eventually leads to an act of defiance from the cello, where it alters the pizzicato's melody, and instead of ascending, it chooses to descend. However, it maintains the same intervallic content of the minor second, the augmented fourth, and a subsequent minor second. Similar to the second movement, this is met with imitation from the other instruments, mirroring the uncontrollable nature of anger. I'll play a short excerpt for you now. The fourth movement, titled Despondency, is currently the last one I have finished composing, and it shows Motive 1 in its barest form, initially appearing with no other instruments accompanying it, as opposed to previously where it was altered or hidden. Like the second and third movement, this motive is imitated and used pervasively throughout the fourth movement, beginning in the viola, migrating to the violin, and finally appearing in the cello. This form of imitation can be called a fugue, and the lack of musical direction inherent to the nature of this motive is meant to be representative of the directionless nature of depression, and its constant presence is meant to be representative of the overpowering nature of despondent thoughts. I'll play a short excerpt for you now. However, hope is not lost quite yet. The end of this movement represents a turning point for the listener and the narrative of the piece. As the movement develops and gradually almost finds a point of resolution through its intense dissonance, it's interrupted by the second movement's panic motive, which in this case is the rising chromatic figure. This, along with the first motive heard in the first movement, initially led to a musical anxiety attack, but instead, it's controlled and gradually transformed into a consonant chord. This is meant to represent the synthesis of these two ideas and the overcoming of anxiety and the willingness to move forward. I'll play an excerpt from the end of the movement for you now. So what exactly is the future of this piece? Well, the following two movements entitled Remembrance and Growth are meant to further synthesize the ideas presented in the first four movements by developing the two principal motives from their originally dissonant roles into a consonant one, demonstrating the ability to overcome struggle and use experiences that are difficult as a catalyst for growth. I hope that my presentation has shown you how a composer may create narrative and cohesion through text painting and the variation of a couple principal motives. Of course, for your consideration, I'd also ask that you please visit the Oregon Composers Forum YouTube page to hear a full performance of Coping Mechanism as well as to hear the works of my colleagues. And of course, thank you for listening.